ask ranking member to ask questions.
Great, thank you. We do find ourselves at a pretty interesting time, and I would agree with each of the witnesses that the rest of the world, whether it's Europe, countries in Asia or elsewhere, are trying to figure out where the United States is and what our strategy is and so forth, and that's creating some uncertainty. But in my interaction with, again, in my travels abroad, but also with ambassadors here in the United States, there's also a deepening recognition that they don't want the United States to leave. And I would say, particularly in Southeast Asia, they recognize that they understand the terms by which China does business, and they want a robust U.S. presence there as an alternative partner. And they also, while we're not, our trade policy, our economic policy isn't just based on benevolence. Much of it, again, in that 75 years post-World War II was benevolent, didn't disadvantage our companies, didn't disadvantage our economy, certainly opened up markets for our companies, and we did very well in that construct, but so did many of the other nations that share similar values to us. And I think that creates an interesting opportunity for us as well, because while they don't like the uncertainty, and I do think most countries around the world appreciated the rules-based order that we had put in place, I think there's a growing recognition that American economic policy is changing a bit. And, again, I'd go back to my 13 years in Congress. We all would have guessed TPP would have, trade deals were never easy. Didn't get across the finish line, and we saw in the 2016 presidential candidate, both candidates turn against TPP. I would have thought, the renegotiation of, or the negotiation of USMCA, which was the largest bipartisan trade bill, close to 400 members of the House of Representatives, more Democrats than Republicans voted to support that process. Would have thought we'd then say maybe we build off of that. Again, we're in a much different place with, I'd urge President Trump to say, okay, if you have issues with Mexico and Canada, you've got a renegotiation coming up. Let's use that as a vehicle by which to address some of this. And then, the orthodoxy around tariffs and what that looks like, again, President might take this as a compliment. He's been incredibly disruptive. I think he's using a very blunt instrument, a blunt tool, but it is getting everyone's attention. I would hope that we on this committee, we in Congress, along with the administration, as we start to approach this, I can't undo the past, but what does that context look like moving forward? I also think the pandemic was a real wake-up call for not just the United States, but most of the world, because of the real dependence on, whether it's the pharmaceutical sector and APIs, protective equipment, rare earths, et cetera, just exposed tremendous vulnerabilities that we have. And if we were to get into a direct confrontation with China, those vulnerabilities, we're seeing it a little bit around the tariff conversation and the trade conversation with China. But it does expose real economic and national security vulnerabilities that not just us, but others have. So the reason why I talk about things like the Mineral Security Partnership, and which again I think is a really good idea, but I also think how we approach trade and economic development in the 21st century is probably going to be more alliance values driven with partners. And what I mean by that is I think we should work with the Koreas of the world, the Japans of the world, the Australias of the world. If we, rare earth elements aren't super rare. It's just, as you pointed out, Ms. Dzinski, the processing of these, it's a dirty business, and I don't know if we're going to do that in the United States, but we ought to go into Malaysia or Vietnam or places that would be willing to do it and build those markets. And we don't have to do that by ourselves. I would say we should do that with like-valued allies that want these redundant supply chains. Australia certainly has expressed an interest. Now, it may cost us a little bit more, and I think that's something that we'll have to try to address. Dr. Norris, I certainly think it's a great idea for us to have a national stockpile of these critical earths, and that is something that we as Congress should explore with the administration of creating that stockpile so we don't have those vulnerabilities. It's going to be different, and again, I will just go back to my supposition, which is this can't be a Democratic or a Republican strategy. This has to be an American strategy, and I think an American strategy in concert with countries that share similar values of the relative open markets, relative democracy, freedom, because it's not a given what the next 75 years looks like, who dominates those 75 years. But I do think, again, in my travels, my conversations, the actions of the first 100 days of the Trump administration have shaken a lot of countries around the world, but it also has brought them to the table to say, hey, wait a minute, we may not like what America's doing, but the last thing we want is America to leave our markets. I'd be curious just quickly if you feel like that's characterizing it in the right way, and maybe we'll start with Ms. Dzinski. Just go.
I do think that's the right characterization. There is a long-term strategy here, but there's also a lot of tactical back and forth right now that is probably causing some confusion. But I think what we're seeing now is the display of economic power in a way that we haven't seen it before. And whether we agree or don't agree with how the tools are being used, we do have an administration that's using them in some pretty interesting ways. I'll go back to an earlier comment that I do think it's time for a pretty broad trade reset, and we need to think about it holistically and ultimately getting back to this near global economy idea. So we box out the countries that don't want to participate in a free and open market, and to your point, we ally shore. We ally shore where we can. We bring home production where that's required and necessary. We do that. And where we can't do that, we work with allies and partners.
Dr. Norris.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with a lot of what you said, and also what my fellow panelists are saying. I think the United States does enjoy a significant incumbency advantage for having written a lot of the international rules of the order. I don't always think that we're taking full advantage of that opportunity. And I think that when we think about this competition, it's important to maintain flexibility, the ability to adapt. We have to be able to do us better. We are an incredible nation that has incredible capabilities. And when we think about how are we going to compete, we're not going to compete because we're going to mimic and do something that they're doing and try to make it fit for us. We have to think about what are we good at? And that's why I come back to innovation. I mean, we can completely change a paradigm with our radical capacity to innovate in this country. We have to preserve that capability. That's really important in a long-run competition. I also think that your point about making this bipartisan, making it something that's not going to lurch from one administration to the next or one Congress to the next is really important. And this is a long-run competition that's going to have to be run in a series of sprints. And they're going to be 4-year sprints or 2-year sprints. And we need to find strategies that are sustainable politically, economically, and socially for our fairly partisan and fairly divided country right now. I think that's really important. And I just would also agree that the idea of having trade and economic development be somewhat contingent on similar shared values, I think makes a lot of sense. There's nothing that quite clarifies who your friends are than a pretty significant new challenge that you collectively face, and you have to sort of say, okay, who do I want to have on my side? And that's kind of the moment we're in right now. And I think we can, to your point, this is kind of a unique moment. We should try to capitalize on it as best as we can to position ourselves for success for decades to come.
Ms. Cutler.
I also agree with almost everything he said. And particularly, I do think there is an opportunity here, okay? But what my concern is, we may squander that opportunity. And this is such a critical time where, based on all our discussion this morning, our allies and partners are extremely important in order to work with in order to achieve our objectives. So my view is carrots and sticks. Let's keep those carrots in mind. I think to date, we've been doing a pretty good job competing with China for the hearts and minds of third countries. But I worry through heavy-handed tariff requests, win-lose trade negotiations, and then the dismantling of a lot of our soft power, we may squander this opportunity if we don't all work together, Congress, the administration, the private sector, to really double down on our strengths and work with our allies and partners.
Yeah, a colleague and I are doing a project in which we've been talking to a bunch of trading partners, mainly through their embassies, a few capitals, and we actually started this before the election, and we were trying to look at sort of what U.S. really needs from its trading partners and what it's willing to offer, what it needs to offer to get them to give those things. The conversation has diverted to, a lot of this uncertainty and confusion around tariffs, but I take away the same point you do, which is that while people are disturbed and troubled by that, there's a demand signal. They want to work with the United States, maybe in a slightly different way than the past. They recognize it's going to be different, but they want our engagement. They want our market still. They want our products. They want our leadership. They want, maybe access to our innovation ecosystem, which is a sort of new thing that we may be able to, it's not new, but I mean, we could package it as a new offer. So I do think there's a big opportunity, and I think the key is two things I want to say about trade policy going forward. One, we need a trade policy that combines sort of three things. One, it has to advance American interests, economically, strategically, other ways. Second, it has to incentivize our partners to want to work with us and give them some reason to give us the things we need. And third, it has to win the support of the American people, and that's really your job. But I do think the second point I want to make is it's really important for you guys to figure this out because in the end, if we don't have a trade policy that is embedded in law through you, it's not going to stick. It's going to be a house made of cards. You need the pylons dug deep into the soil, and that means you need legislated trade agreements, in my view.